Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Hashtag Got Money. As always, my profound pleasure to welcome to Got Money, Mr. Terry Ryder from Hotspotting. Terry, welcome to Got Money.
Well, it is always good to talk to you about any subject, but particularly about residential property, which we're both passionate about.
Incredibly so. I was saying to you before the start of the show, honestly, I spent a good part of 2 days trying to find land in the Sunshine Coast, and my lord, it's tightly held and it's expensive and all the good land's gone. And it kind of goes against the narrative which we're reading in the paper about the market not doing so great. Do you want to unpack that for us a little bit?
Oh, yeah, but the narrative is, to put it politely, is crap. I mean, the messages that we're getting from mainstream media are just, there's such a disconnect between, major newspapers in particular and what's really going on out there in Australia. The problem, as always, we've talked about it before, is that most of our major media comes out of Sydney and Melbourne. Most of the people they quote, like economists, are based in Sydney and Melbourne, and they think that's Australia. They think that what's happening in Melbourne or in Sydney is pretty much what's happening across Australia. And in actual fact, I've had a look at this and thought about it. Sydney and Melbourne have actually been the exception to the rule pretty much for the last 10 years. You know, when Sydney and Melbourne were booming, we were told we had a national property boom, but we didn't because it was just happening in Sydney and Melbourne. When they went into downturn after the boom, we were told we had a national downturn, but we didn't because it was just happening in the two biggest cities. When we hear about, vacancies being really high, they're talking about the inner city Sydney and inner city Melbourne. The rest of Australia's got ultra low vacancies. So there's this huge dichotomy between the two biggest cities and their situation, which is what we're seeing in mainstream media, and what's happening in the rest of Australia, where 2/3 of Australians live. And most of Australia actually has strong markets, prices holding the line or rising, vacancies ultra low and rents rising. Just a completely different situation, but we're not getting that message.
Why? I think these are like, I read through the Observer, which is one of the online property portal websites that I occasionally go to, and you're a writer for them. You do a lot of really great work for them. And some of the organisations that you've quoted that are misquoting what's happening in Australia are meant to be leaders in the property space, and I don't want to quote their names because it would be undignified and it would be embarrassing. So why are they so set on this micro market? Why do they not look at the macro market and those little pockets that are doing really well?
It's just tunnel vision, really. Sydney people think that, what's happening in Sydney is way more important than what's happening anywhere else. They think Sydney is Australia, which it isn't.
I don't know if we can offend Australians, Sydney guys, any more than we just had in the last 2 minutes.
Well, and the other thing is, the people, disseminating this stuff really don't give a damn. It's all about the clickbait headline. The truth is optional, and a lot of them just don't know any better anyway. They're not real estate experts. What most journalists out there are doing is recycling press releases. That's pretty much 100% of their jobs, particularly when it comes to residential property, the housing market. Most of what we're seeing in our major papers, the online news services, if you can call them news services, radio and television, they're just recycling press release material, which is propaganda from someone. And what the people who write and distribute the press releases know to be true is their chances of getting traction with their press release are enhanced enormously if they say something sensationally negative, particularly about the housing market. So that's what they pump out. So an example of that was published recently by one of the big providers of data and analysis and commentary, Domain, one of the big websites.
I wasn't going to say them, but I thought I'd make that say their name.
Part of the Fairfax empire, and they put out the stuff about how long it takes for first home buyers to save a deposit for a new home. And of course, they wanted to arrive at a an alarming outcome, because their chances of getting in the paper are much greater if they have this alarming outcome. So what do? They come up with a formula which is so disconnected from reality that it's completely irrelevant. They're talking about a 20% deposit. Nobody needs a 20%. No one saves a 20% deposit because you don't need one. They're talking about houses, of course, never apartments, which a lot of young people prefer. And they're talking about the two most expensive cities in Australia, and 2/3 of Australians live in much cheaper places. So to arrive at the formula, which says it takes 6.5 years for a young couple to save a deposit to get into a new home, they're talking about 20% deposit to buy a house in Sydney. I mean,
Yeah.
how divorced is that from the reality of most first-home buyers? They only need a 5% deposit. They probably prefer an apartment anyway, but even if it's a house, what about Brisbane? What about Perth, Adelaide? What about Wollongong and Newcastle and the Sunshine Coast where prices are much lower? How long does it actually take to save a 5% deposit to buy a lower priced apartment in, say, Brisbane? Well, it's actually 9 months. It's not 6.5 years, it's 9 months. But of course, that wasn't part of the coverage that we saw in major newspapers. We were told that it's hopeless for young, and the reality is that the strongest, most active cohort out there in the market right now is first-home buyers. They're going ballistic because, they only need a 5% deposit, and they've got all this government assistance, state and federal, and they've got the lowest interest rates ever. They're not competing with investors because investors are largely sitting on the fence. So it's a fantastic time to be a first-home buyer. But media was telling us for the past week or so that it's hopeless for first-home buyers.
Oh, no.
Utter bullshit, and they don't care. They just don't care.
We're taking care of at least 10 new clients a week, and we're about to expand into an entirely different market, and it will more than likely be 20 to 30 new buyers a week, and that's the state of the market. The issue that we're having is land, Terry. So these affordable areas. So for Victoria, and if I get it wrong, tell me, it's Ballarat, Geelong and Bendigo, there's just no land. There's no titled land. It's actually been swept up. And that's the issue that they're facing right now. But I agree with you. The ability to help these first-time home buyers into the market is extraordinary. I don't know any other country in the world that would say, here's 25 grand to help you buy a house.
Exactly.
Could you imagine them doing that in New Zealand? Can you imagine they're saying, hey, here's 25 grand plus your $10,000 first-time home buyers grant?
Yeah, so there's grants from the federal government, grants from the state government, stamp duty exemptions or concessions from the state government, the scheme whereby you only need a 5% deposit and you don't have to pay mortgage insurance. I mean, what an amazing situation for young people looking to buy their first home, plus interest rates that have never been so low, and absence of competition in many cases from investors. It's just a perfect storm for first home buyers, and they're reacting to it. They're out there in force. There were some figures from Aussie Home Loans about a week ago which said figures on pre-approval of loans, and that there'd been like a 70% increase since the start of the year in pre-approved loans to buy houses, and more than half of them were first home buyers. Just shows, so they're out there in force. And if you're an investor, you'd be very wise to look at the trends and look at where first home buyers are targeting, because there's going to be price rises there for sure. There already are in many of these cases, many of these locations, because of the weight of demand from first home buyers. And if you want to buy somewhere where prices have got upward momentum, then follow the first home buyer trend.
So is this sustainable is the next question, because we know that this is all pinned around these grants, and they're going to be swept away shortly, certainly the 25,000 builders bonus. What happens after that?
Well, I mean, there's always going to be a level of government assistance for first home buyers. It's simply the case that right now there's an enhanced level, there's a heightened level of assistance, but we're always going to have state governments with their stamp duty concessions and their other grants. They've been in place for quite a while. It's just that because of the pandemic, we've got this extra thing, home builder. But the federal government thing that allows first home buyers to get by with just a 5% deposit without paying mortgage insurance, that actually predated the the pandemic thing. So that wasn't actually a stimulus measure because of the pandemic. That was just something that the federal government thought was a good thing to do. So many of these things will continue in some form. It's not as if they're all going to be cut off suddenly and the market will fall in a heap. So I think it probably is sustainable. I mean, there's always going to be first home buyers keen to get into the market. There's some research recently that said that right now, in most locations around Australia, it's actually cheaper to buy than to rent, looking at a typical scenario.
Yeah.
That's another factor in their favour. Interest rates aren't going to change very much anytime soon. If they're going to do anything in the short term, they'll go lower. And we've had an announcement just in the last week from Commonwealth Bank saying they're cutting interest rates for both investors and for home buyers. So a lot of the circumstances that are pumping up first home buyers are actually going to be in place, certainly for the medium term. It's not all sort of a bit of a short term sugar hit and then it's all going to stop. I think it's going to continue.
You are giving Perth the biggest rap. You love Perth. Isn't Perth just, I kind of wonder about Perth and its sustainability long term as well, but you and Bernard Salt seem to love it. What's the go on Perth right now?
Yeah, Perth is probably, you could almost argue, it is the number one market amongst the capital cities right now in terms of activity. There's been a big response to all of the things we've just talked about. But also another factor is that the Western Australian economy is coming back quite strongly. The resources sector is strong. It's probably going to continue to be as this country and also other countries move into a recovery phase after the pandemic. There's going to be big demand for Western Australian iron ore. But also it's noticeable that the cities that have got the pandemic under control the best, the soonest, like Perth and Western Australia, are places where the economy is more confident and strong, and out of that comes rising property markets. Vacancies also have fallen a lot. A couple of years ago, vacancies in Perth were 4 or 5%, and now they're really low, down around 1%. So that's pushing up rentals, and that gives impetus to prices. So there's a lot of ducks falling into line at last for Perth because they've been in the doldrums for 5 or 6 years.
That's been a market that people have literally avoided. So Perth, absolutely. What about Tasmania? How's Tasmania doing inside of all of this?
Look, Tasmania is going well. It's one of those places, and there's a few examples elsewhere, like Ballarat's another example of this, where the market had, I was pretty sure it peaked. It had passed its peak after 2 or 3 really strong years. That's true of Hobart and Tasmania. It's true of Ballarat. But the pandemic situation has actually given it a second wave of another surge of demand. And so I think I was having a discussion with another research professional earlier today, and he was commenting that he believes that Hobart's going to have another surge. And it's all about the exodus to affordable lifestyle, as I call it, the one that's been pumping up the Ballarats and the Bendigos of this world. People are leaving the big cities and going somewhere, realising that they can work remotely perhaps. It's also about people bringing forward their retirement plans, all sorts of reasons. But it's also people are moving to Tasmania for a cooler climate. I mean, that's going to be a factor. It's going to keep their economy and market strong long term because, regardless of what some people like the Prime Minister think, climate change is real. The bushfire thing is scaring people. I'm one of those who are beyond concerned. I'm bloody really scared about it. It's just alarming. And people are moving to Tasmania for a cooler climate. And so there's lots of reasons. Well, the other thing about Tasmania is the latest ComSec State of the State report, which has seen Tasmania rising up the rankings. It used to be rock bottom last, going back a few years, and it still wasn't ranking. The latest quarterly report from ComSec has Tasmania number 1, the leading economy in the nation. And that's happened for all sorts of reasons. There's, that place is pumping. Used to be the poor relation of Australia.
It was the New Zealand, wasn't it? It was like the New Zealand of Australia.
It was, all the research that we do, we used to look at various indicators for some of our reports, and Tasmania always came 7th or 8th out of the 8 states and territories. You know, it was right down the bottom, but it's changed. And a lot of people still think it's like that because they're not up to date with the new situation. But Tasmania is now a very strong economy. People are moving there in large numbers for affordability, for a cooler climate. You know, the exodus to affordable lifestyle. Tasmania is a great place. I mean, I've thought about moving there myself. I know lots of people who used to live in my town have actually moved to Tasmania for various reasons. And I think their market's going to keep on pumping. Launceston, Hobart, Devonport up in the north, all sorts of places around Tasmania. They've been strong for a few years, and I think they're going to continue to be.
Isn't that, that's so nice for them. Like, hooray for Tasmania, because you're right, it has been the ugly cousin at the ball, hasn't it, really? Just quietly. So what about, how are you feeling about Victoria then? What's our market looking like up here? I mean, we're just delighted that we can now see clients at displays, which is fantastic.
Yeah, well, regional Victoria, great. I mean, it's been strong for a number of years. It's going to continue to be for many of the reasons we've already discussed. But the biggest one is the exodus to affordable lifestyle. And I think that's been strongest in Victoria of anywhere in the country. It's happening around the country, but it's happened first in Victoria, and it's still happening. So places like Bendigo, but it's expanded further out. I mean, Warrnambool, Mildura, Albury, Wodonga, they're all getting uplift from this trend of people deciding we don't need to be in the big expensive city anymore. We can work remotely, or we can move to a place where, you know, it's got a strong economy and there's jobs there. We're not just, it's not just about thinking about a Melbourne career. There's careers to be had in other parts of Victoria. Melbourne, you know, it's kind of hard because it's been through this unnatural, unprecedented situation. How will it come out of that? I think actually it's going to come out. I think we've already seen evidence now that some of the restrictions have been eased, and you can actually have one-on-one, you know, open inspection sort of situations, which hasn't been the case for a number of weeks. Things have seemed to be getting back to relative normality quite quickly. What I would say about real estate generally is that the pandemic period has been a fantastic advertisement for residential property as an asset class. I mean, how remarkable has it been? Everyone at the beginning, well, not everybody, but the idiot economists that we listen to far too much, predicted 20-30% decline in our property prices, and it should have happened by now because they were saying, you know, in 6 months prices will have collapsed. Well, they didn't. They haven't at all. No. Not even in Melbourne with all its trials and tribulations. It's a great advertisement for residential property for the strength and resilience of it. And I think we're going to see that in Melbourne because Melbourne is an amazing city, an amazing economy, and it's, you know, very, very strong property market. You know, all things, you know, putting aside the recent pandemic period, I'd say it's, you know, it's the #1 market in Australia, really. It's got so much going for it. And I think we're going to see it come back strongly. People are going to come out of lockdown when how can I refer to the Premier without being insulting? When Mr. Andrews...
Jesus, you've done everybody, mate. You've done everybody in this recording.
I mean, how that man has avoided resigning by now, I don't know. But anyway, that's another subject. When Melbourne is allowed to come strongly out of lockdown, I think we're going to see the Melbourne property market just pump because people are going to say, you beauty, we can get back to normal and do what we wanted to do.
Well, vacancy rates are really low. Every property that you can imagine in some of these. Now, look, I've got to be, there's a cautionary line around this or circle around it. There are some areas where there are a high saturation of apartments and probably not doing so well. But there are areas, I looked at Ballarat the other day and it's 1.2% vacancy rates. It's like, wow.
But, you know, that's the norm around the country. Vacancy rates 1% and lower are actually the norm. It's in some places they've never had vacancy rates so low. And large parts of Melbourne also have low vacancies. It's just the inner city, the big high-rise apartment areas where for various reasons vacancies have gone high, but that's
What's going to happen to them, Terry? What's going to happen to those empty apartments?
Well, some of them will fill back up again. I mean, when we get back to normal and Airbnb can happen again, I mean, the main reason why we have those high vacancies in the inner city areas of our big cities is because Airbnb stopped working for the investor owners because of, lockdown and border closures and all of that. When we get back to the new normal, some of that will come back. So, but, it's going to take time. But, out there, beyond the inner city where most Melburnians live. So I think the parts of the Melbourne market that will come back will include the first home buyer areas, the outer ring areas, affordable apartments, perhaps middle ring suburbs. I think there's really good value in some of those middle ring northern areas, the Brunswick type suburbs. I think we're going to see those areas do well. And of course, there's a section of the market. We're still seeing really amazing sales happening in Sydney and Melbourne. I think in Sydney at auction, there was like a record price paid at the weekend. An unbelievable price for a property that the buyer hadn't even seen, apparently. So
I love hanging out with you because you and I are both really optimistic about the market. And I know to be optimistic because I get the inquiry level. So I know, I know the market's doing really well, but then I do what you do. I go and listen to somebody on the news for 5 minutes and it just irritates me. So thank you.
Because their ignorance is appalling. But let me just run one. Let me run past you just one statistic, because we've got a client who asked us to do a report on the suburb of Hawthorn East, right? So we looked up the numbers. So these are the core logic numbers for Hawthorn East. The median house price, according to these numbers, has increased 33% in the last 12 months, including 15% in the last quarter. The median apartment price in Hawthorn East is up 15% in the past 12 months, including 7% in the most recent quarter. These are not small sales volumes, 120 house sales and 130 apartment sales in the past year. So, there's substantial numbers there. Now, I'm not suggesting that's happening right across Melbourne, but it really just struck me as amazing numbers, given what's been happening in Melbourne this year, that we still have a situation where sales are happening and prices are rising in, this is one of the better areas of Melbourne. Not only that suburb, but the ones around it, upmarket. So that section of the market, we're seeing that in Sydney as well, is kind of unaffected by everything that's happening. And there's still people out there with lots of money and they've got reasons to buy real estate, and they do. And so you get results like that. How remarkable.
Oh, I love it. And I think you coined it beautifully when we first started the interview. You said this is the best asset class. And I have to agree with you. You could, everybody needs a roof over their head. Everybody needs a roof over their head. And you can touch it and you can see it and you can smell it and you can drive by it. And I'm afraid that this will always be, for any of you that want to talk to me about stocks and shares, forget it. Oh, my main go-to is real estate. Terry Ryder, thank you for joining me today on Got Money. As always, enlightening and so much fun. And I'll be here editing most of that for a wee while.
It's been way too long. Let's do it again soon.
Always, man. I love having you on. You're such a realist. My God, bring some of that good old Kiwi folklore and a beer, and we'll sit down and chew it over for days. Thank you, everyone that makes Got Money possible. We're still working remotely. You're amazing. To my team, my podcaster and my friend Carolyn Lloyd that puts this up for me. I appreciate you. Stay safe, everyone. And if you have any questions for any of our guests, please reach out to us to Got Money. If you've missed any of our shows, please go to our YouTube channel on Got Money.